Lecture 31. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Virtual University's course on Business and Technical Communication. In today's lecture, we will look at how to use visual aids in your business and technical writing. We'll learn to look for places where visual aids will help you achieve your communication objectives. We will also look at how to choose visual aids which are appropriate to your objectives. As you know, there are many different types of visual aids. So you need to decide which visual aid is appropriate for your objective, the purpose of your communication. We will also look at how to make your visual aids easy to understand and easy to use, and how to fully integrate your visual aids with your prose. Now, visual aids are more than just aids. The name visual aids can be misleading because it suggests that they are aids to the prose, that in the writing that you do at work, your words are primary and visual aids are merely assistants. However, this is not the case. Your visual aids are absolutely as necessary and as important as the prose that you are writing is. When used effectively and creatively, visual aids are an integral part of communications. They are as important as the prose that they are accompanying. In some situations, in fact, visual aids can carry the entire message. They can exist without prose. For instance, if you've ever flown, you may recall reaching into the pocket on the back of the seat in front of you to pull out a sheet of instructions for leaving the plane in an emergency. That sheet has no prose, there are only pictures, and the whole process is illustrated through pictures. Many airlines use these sheets and they are wordless. They only rely on visual aids. However, you in a business situation may never create a communication that relies solely on visual aids. Most of the times, in fact, probably all the time, your communications will integrate visual aids with some form of prose. You should remember that visual aids are powerful communication tools. They are not merely decorations or supplements or accessories to prose. They are very powerful, but they need to be used properly. The guidelines discussed in this lecture will help you not only with visual aids that you make using traditional methods, but also visual aids that you might create on a computer. In this day and age, increasingly we use visual aids through the computer anyway, so we are going to talk about that. Also, we are going to talk about how to design visual aids using the computer, because many computer programs which make visual aids leave essential decisions, especially essential decisions regarding design, to the person who is writing, who's doing the writing, or the person who's actually putting in the visual aid, which is you. So even though you are using the computer, even though the aid will be given to you by the computer, you need to make essential decisions about the design of that visual aid. For instance, if you're using a program to make a line graph, you will still have to decide which variable to place on the horizontal axis and which variable to place on the vertical axis. You will still have to decide what intervals to use for your variables and what your labels should say. So although the graph will be designed for you, the physical aspect of the graph will be designed for you, the decisions about what goes where, how you should actually input the information, what type of labeling to use, etc., will be decisions that you will make, and you need to keep a lot of considerations in mind when you are making these decisions, and it is these considerations that we will focus on today. If you use a computer program that doesn't leave the basic decisions to you, you will have to determine whether the design that is created by the program is good or not. According to your purpose, according to your need, you will need to then decide whether that design is appropriate or not as well. If you determine that the program's standard designs aren't good, you should obtain a different program or make the visual aids in some other way. So you will need to know exactly what is needed in a visual aid, exactly what aspects you need to keep in mind when designing a visual aid, so that you can make good discerning decisions about what program to use, what visual aid to include in your text, and how to do it. Computer programs for visual aids may present one other difficulty as well. If you create fancy visual aids, some people become so enthralled and so excited by the program's ability to create special effects that they forget the purpose and the readers of their communication. So a lot of the times what people do is that when they're writing, when they're including visual aids in their writing, they tend to go with the look of the visual aid rather than the purpose of that. और वो अपने visual aid को खूबसूरत बनाने में और उसको attractive बनाने में इतने engross हो जाते हैं कि वो ये भूल जाते हैं कि उसका purpose क्या था और readers जो हैं उनको इससे क्या समझ आएगी, कुछ समझ भी आएगी या नहीं आएगी, या ये सिर्फ खूबसूरत ही लगेगा. And that believe me tends to be a very major problem when working with computers, because obviously there are so many facilities when you're working with the computer, and there are so many different options that you can have. You can play around with so many different visual aids and programs that one tends to lose track of the real purpose behind actually including that visual aid. So you need to stay focused, and you need to be clear that the visual aid that you're designing is actually serving the purpose that you want it to serve, and that it is actually aiding the reader in their communication and in their understanding of the message. Now we're going to have a look at some guidelines for using visual aids in your business communication. First of all, you need to look for places where visual aids will help you achieve your communication objectives. The first step in using visual aids effectively is to search actively for places where they can help you achieve your communication objectives. आपने अपने टेक्स्ट में, अपनी प्रोज में देखना है कि वो कौन कौन सी जगह हैं जहां आप विजुअल एड डालेंगे तो आपका जो कम्युनिकेशन है वो और बेहतर होगी. आपके जो ऑब्जेक्टिव्स आप अचीव करना चाह रहे हैं उस कम्युनिकेशन से वो ज़्यादा बेहतर अचीव होंगे. अगर आप किसी को परसुएड करना चाह रहे हैं, अगर आप कोई फैक्ट सिखाना चाह रहे हैं, अगर आप कोई रिजल्ट की डिस्कशन कर रहे हैं, तो उस हिसाब से कौन से विजुअल एड्स कहाँ आएंगे कि वो डिस्कशन जो है वो और बेहतर हो जाए और इफेक्टिव हो जाए. You also need to use visual aids to show what something looks like. In every field, people describe physical objects, machines, experimental apparatus, organs of animals, etc. So, you will need to describe something or the other when you're doing your business writing. For instance, an engineer who designs a new hinge can explain the designs and its virtues to other engineers who might want to use it much better with diagrams than he could do it with words. So if similarly, if you need to describe something and describe what it looks like, then visual aids are very essential. They're a very essential tool in helping you, in aiding you to describe the physical properties and the physicality of objects. Also, visual aids show how to do something. In many circumstances, visual aids provide the best form of instructions. In the previous lecture, we looked at instructions, and we also talked about the fact that you will be using a lot of visual aids in your instructions. So apart from showing what something looks like, visual aids also show how to do something. It's very easy to give instructions as a series of steps through visual aids. As the example I just mentioned, the aeroplane example, where what to do in an emergency, how to exit the plane in an emergency is shown through a series of diagrams. Similarly, if you need to show people how to do something, then you can do that very easily through pictures. Obviously, since you're in a business-like situation, you will probably be using a lot of prose in it as well, but to accompany that prose, you will have very essential diagrams. For example, if a writer needed to explain how to remove a piece of paper jammed in a photocopy machine, she could do it so much more effectively with the use of diagrams than with words. So similarly, there may be many situations where diagrams, illustrations, etc. can be much more useful in showing how to do something than words will be. You also use visual aids to show how something is organized. At work, you may need to describe the relationships amongst the various departments and divisions of your employer's company or among the parts of a computer system. In such a case, using diagrams can provide readers with an excellent understanding of the complex relationships. You could use a flowchart to show the relationships. You could use a table to show the different relationships or to show differences, etc. You will also be using visual aids to clarify the relationships among numerical data. On the job, you may need to describe the relationships amongst various pieces of data, which may be from laboratory research, surveys, etc. Visual aids can help you make those relationships immediately clear to your readers using graphs and other visual techniques. जो भी आपने अगर कोई न्यूमेरिकल डेटा है आपके पास और आपने उसको दिखाना है और उस डेटा में आपस में आपने रिलेशनशिप्स दिखानी है, तो वो भी बजाय इसके कि आप उसको पैराग्राफ फॉर्म में कहें या आप वर्ड्स इस्तेमाल करें, आप उनके साथ जब विजुअल एड्स इस्तेमाल करेंगे तो वो और बेहतर तरीके से आप रिलेशनशिप्स दिखा सकते हैं. You will also be using visual aids to support your arguments. You can present information in support of your persuasive points. For example, the manufacturer of a plastic insulating material can use visual aids like graphs to persuade greenhouse owners of the comparable effects of different kinds of plastics. So, whatever arguments you are giving in words, you can use visual aids to support that data and actually to make your argument much more effective. Also, visual aids make detailed information easy to find. Sometimes there's a lot of information that you need to give, and if you use visual aids, then it becomes easy for the readers to actually find that information. For many tasks, visual aids are much easier than prose for readers to use and for readers to understand. For example, a manufacturer of photographic film wants to inform trainees of the length of time they should leave the film in the developer's solution. Since the time depends on several factors like tank size, temperature, etc., the information can be conveyed effectively by using a simple table. सारी information को prose में paragraph में लिखने की ज़रूरत नहीं है. एक simple सा table बना के उसमें अगर information दे दी जाए तो वो ज़्यादा आसानी से लोगों को समझ आ जाएगी. Now, some guidelines that you need to keep in mind when making visual aids. Obviously, you will keep in mind all the purposes that we talked about, but you need to remember that to take full advantage of the powerful assistance that visual aids can provide, you need to begin by searching for places to use them when you're making the very first plan of your writing. शुरू में ही जब आप अपनी प्लानिंग ही कर रहे हैं तभी आप देखना शुरू कर दें कि विजुअल एड्स कहाँ बेहतर रहेंगे, कहाँ आपको बेहतरीन हेल्प कर सकते हैं. Early planning will help you coordinate your prose and your visual aids from the beginning, and then thereby you will reduce the amount of time that you will spend on revision. अगर आपने शुरू में प्लान नहीं किया हुआ होगा तो फिर आपको रिविजन में विजुअल एड्स के लिए जगह बनानी पड़ेगी, विजुअल एड्स को फिट इन करना पड़ेगा. इसलिए बेहतर है कि आप पहले प्लानिंग स्टेज पे ही थोड़ा सा टेंटेटिव डिसाइड कर लेंगे कहाँ किस चीज़ को एक्सप्लेन करने के लिए आप विजुअल एड्स लेंगे, आप अपने प्रोज के साथ कहाँ विजुअल एड्स डालेंगे ताकि उस हिसाब से आप अपने कम्युनिकेशन को स्ट्रक्चर करें. Although visual aids can help you immensely, you should guard against putting them in thoughtlessly and mindlessly. Be sure that each visual aid is designed to achieve its specific purpose. Once you have decided where to use visual aids, you must decide which type of visual aid to use. पहले तो हमने कहा कि आप जब अपनी प्लानिंग कर रहे हैं तब आप ये डिसाइड कर लें कि कहाँ आप विजुअल एड्स इस्तेमाल करेंगे. आप जब आपने जगह डिटर्मिन कर ली कि इन जगहों पे मैंने विजुअल एड के साथ इस इंफॉर्मेशन को क्लैरिफाई करना है, तो फिर आप ये भी देखना आपको लिए ज़रूरी है कि आप किस किस्म का विजुअल एड इस्तेमाल करेंगे. हर विजुअल एड हर पर्पस के लिए नहीं होता. First, you will need to consider the objectives of your visual aid, thinking about those objectives in exactly the same way as you think about the objectives of your overall communication. आपने ये सोचना है कि आखिर आप इस जगह पे विजुअल एड क्यों चाह रहे हैं, जो आप विजुअल एड यहाँ डालना चाह रहे हैं वो क्या मकसद उसका है और वो क्या काम करेगा. You need to identify the task you want the visual aid to enable your readers to perform while reading your visual aid, and then decide how you want the visual aid to affect your readers' attitudes. Now, how do you consider your readers' tasks? Different visual aids are suited to different reading tasks. Often the same information can be presented in many different ways. एक इंफॉर्मेशन है उसको आप टेबल में भी प्रेजेंट कर सकते हैं, उसको आप पाई चार्ट में भी प्रेजेंट कर सकते हैं, लेकिन हो सकता है उसका एम्फोसिस फ़र्क हो जाए, उसका जो उससे इंफॉर्मेशन पढ़ने वाले को मिले उसका थोड़ा सा शेड फ़र्क हो जाए. सो दैट्स व्हाई यू नीड टू बी अवेयर ऑफ द पर्पस of your communication. You need to be aware of the purpose of using a visual aid in that a particular visual aid in that particular communication, and you also need to be aware of keeping in mind that purpose, what visual aid you will use. Let's have a look at the example of Ben, who collected information on the starting salaries of people who graduated from 3 different departments in university. Now, which visual aid should he use? बेन दिखाना चाह रहे हैं कि 3 मुख्तलिफ डिपार्टमेंट से जो लोग ग्रेजुएट किए हैं उनको किस तरह की स्टार्टिंग सैलरीज मिली हैं. अब यही इंफॉर्मेशन वो खासे डिफरेंट तरीकों से दिखा सकते हैं. इफ बेन्स पर्पस इज सिंपली टू एनेबल द रीडर्स टू लर्न द एवरेज स्टार्टिंग सैलरी ऑफ द ग्रेजुएट्स, ही कुड यूज अ टेबल. इफ बेन वांट्स देम टू बी एबल टू सी एट अ ग्लांस हाउ द एवरेज स्टार्टिंग सैलरी इन देयर डिपार्टमेंट कंपेयर्ड विद दोज in that same year from other departments, he could use a bar graph. एक bar graph से comparisons बहुत अच्छे नज़र आ जाते हैं over a period of time. If Ben wants his readers to be able to see how the average starting salary in their departments changed over the years, and if he wants to compare that change with the changes experienced by other departments, he could use a line graph. Line graph में एक trend जो होता है ओवर द इयर्स वो बहुत अच्छा पता चलता है, और अगर आप 2 डिफरेंट चीज़ों का भी ट्रेंड देखना चाह रहे हैं तो वो भी लाइन ग्राफ से बहुत अच्छा पता चलता है. तो ऑल्दो द इंफॉर्मेशन वुड बी द सेम, द मोड ऑफ एक्सप्रेसिंग दैट इंफॉर्मेशन विल चेंज डिपेंडिंग ऑन द पर्पस ऑफ दैट कम्युनिकेशन. इन एडिशन टू थिंकिंग अबाउट योर रीडर्स टास्क्स, यू शुड ऑल्सो लुक टू पिक द टाइप ऑफ विजुअल एड दैट मोस्ट क्विकली एंड ड्रामेटिकली communicates the evidence to support your persuasive point. For instance, showing the effect of a decrease in revenue in a line graph is much more suitable than a tabular form, which requires the readers to do a lot of subtracting to appreciate the extent of the decrease. जिस तरह कि हमने बेन के एग्जाम्पल में भी देखा, इंफॉर्मेशन एक ही टाइप की थी, लेकिन जब पर्पसेस चेंज हुए तो उनने विजुअल एड की टाइप भी चेंज की ताकि उनका जो पॉइंट है वो ज़्यादा परसुएसिवली रीडर्स को समझ आए. इसी तरह अगर आप एक किसी चीज़ का रेवेन्यू का डिक्रीज दिखा रहे हैं तो उसको लाइन ग्राफ के तौर पे आप दिखाएंगे तो वो ज़्यादा बेहतर समझ आएगी पढ़ने वालों को. अगर आप उसमें उसको बार चार्ट के तौर पे दिखाएंगे तो वो रीडर्स को उसमें बहुत मेहनत करनी पड़ेगी वैल्यूज़ को समझने के लिए, उनको कुछ सब्ट्रैक्शन करनी पड़ेगी देखने के लिए कि चेंजेस कितने हैं. रीडर्स विल नॉट फाइंड आवर विजुअल एड्स आइदर यूजफुल और परसुएसिव unless we use the ones that the readers know how to read. अगर हम इस तरह के visual aids इस्तेमाल करेंगे जो हमारे readers को समझ ही नहीं आएंगे तो फिर जाहिर है उन visual aids का readers के ऊपर कोई positive effect नहीं होगा. So we need to consider the reader's knowledge as well and the reader's attitude. How is the reader likely to react when faced with a particular type of a visual aid? Although there are some visual aids that are familiar to us all, like bar graphs, pie charts, etc. There are other visual aids which are much more specialized. So when you're using specialized visual aids, keep in mind your audience's knowledge as well and your audience's attitude when being confronted with such a visual aid. Although these visual aids which are not familiar to readers, the unfamiliar visual aids may be very informative. If there is symbols or specific conventions they are used, if they might be very useful, but they are only useful for an audience who will understand them. For other audiences, it will just baffle them. So try to avoid using non-conventional visual aids unless you are very sure that your readers will actually understand them. Be especially careful to avoid making the mistake of assuming that your potential readers know how to read specialized figures. Don't just assume that they know. ज़रूरी नहीं है कि अगर आपको specialized figures या ज़्यादा technical visual aids जो हैं अगर आपको उनके बारे में पता है तो आपके पढ़ने वालों को भी पता हो. You need to make your visual aids easy to understand and easy to use. Having chosen the type of visual aid you use, you must design it yourself. जो भी visual aid है उसमें जो आप information डालेंगे वो आपने खुद input करनी है और आपने इस तरह करनी है कि आपके पढ़ने वाले को आराम से वो समझ आ जाए. When doing that, remember that like your prose, your visual aids should be easy for your readers to understand and use. The most important step in designing visual aids that are easy to understand and easy to use is to imagine that your readers are in the act of actually using the visual aid. सोचें कि जब आप visual aid बना रहे हैं तब अपने readers का सोचें कि वो जब उसको actually देख रहे हैं, उसको use कर रहे हैं तो वो क्या experience कर रहे हैं. So design your visual aids to support your readers' tasks. Design them to make it easy for the reader to understand them. Remember that you are not only trying to display information, but you're also trying to help your readers understand and use that information. So keeping that in mind, keep your visual aids simple. Avoid the temptation of cramming too much information into your visual aids. Sometimes 2 or 3 visual aids can communicate the same information more effectively than one visual aid. तो अगर आपको लग रहा है कि आप अपने जो भी डायग्राम या चार्ट है उसके अंदर बहुत ज़्यादा इन्फॉर्मेशन डाल रहे हैं और वो शायद आपके पढ़ने वाले के लिए कंफ्यूजिंग हो जाए, तो एक मिनट उसको देखें गौर से और देखें कि कौन कौन सी इन्फॉर्मेशन है जो इसमें से आप कम कर सकते हैं और उसको किसी और तरीके से आप एक्सप्रेस कर सकते हैं, किसी और विजुअल एड के थ्रू एक्सप्रेस कर सकते हैं. अगर आपको एक विजुअल एड को ब्रेक डाउन करके उसकी जगह 2-3 विजुअल एड्स भी देने पड़े तो वो शायद बेहतर हो बनिस्बत इसके कि आप एक ही विजुअल एड के अंदर सारी इन्फॉर्मेशन क्रैम कर दें. Simplifying visual aids means that you are removing unnecessary details. So you should do that as well. You can either split up the detail into different visual aids so that you're giving all that information but it's in small doses, or you can even delete some information if you feel that it might be unnecessary. So आपने खुद ये फैसला करना है कि कौन सी इन्फॉर्मेशन कहाँ जाएगी और कौन सी इन्फॉर्मेशन रहेगी भी आपके विजुअल एड में या बिल्कुल ख़त्म हो जाएगी. Like unnecessary words in prose, superfluous details in visual aids create extra unproductive work for readers and they obscure the really important information. So you need to delete any unnecessary information that there might be in your diagrams or charts. You will find great variation from situation to situation in the kind of details you need to eliminate. The general procedure, however, remains the same. Find and eliminate any details not needed to understand and use your visual aid. ये एक general rule है जो कि आपने ज़रूर अप्लाई करना है कि कोई information है जो आपको लगता है कि आपके visual aid में ज़रूरी नहीं है, इसके बगैर भी जो ऑडियंस हैं उनको वही पैगाम मिलेगा जो इसके साथ मिलेगा, तो उस इंफॉर्मेशन को फिर आप हटा दीजिए. You also need to label the important content clearly. While it's important for you to eliminate unnecessary details from your visual aids, it is also crucial to include labels for the important content. Labels will help people know what they are seeing when they read a figure or a diagram or a chart. To create labels, first determine what parts need labeling. पहले तो आपने सबसे पहले ये डिसाइड करना है कि कौन कौन से हिस्से हैं आपके विजुअल एड में जिनको लेबल्स की ज़रूरत है. हर हिस्से को लेबल करने की ज़रूरत नहीं होती. In some cases, it's easy to determine this. For instance, every row and column usually needs a heading. In other cases, you should label every part that your readers will need to find in a particular visual aid. अगर कुछ ऐसी चीज़ें हैं जो आपके रीडर्स को ज़रूरत ही नहीं है एक विजुअल एड में को समझने के लिए, तो उन चीज़ों को लेबल करने की फिर आपको ज़रूरत नहीं है. So basically you need to avoid labeling parts that your readers will not be looking for. You will only label the parts that your readers will be looking for. Unnecessary labels clutter a visual aid and make it difficult to understand and difficult to use, and that is something that we don't want to do. Some visual aids don't even need labels. For instance, the title of your visual aid may make it clear what the important parts are. तो अगर आपके टाइटल से ही पता चल रहा है कि important parts क्या हैं, तो शायद आपके visual aid को labels की ज़रूरत भी ना हो. After deciding which parts need a label, choose the appropriate word or words and place them where they are easy to see. If readers might be unsure what part is identified by the label, draw a line from the label to the part so that the connection becomes immediately clear. You also need to provide informative titles to your visual aids. Titles help your readers find the visual aids that they're looking for, and they also help them to know what the visual aids contain and when they've actually found them. To help your audience understand and use your visual aids, you should make the descriptive part of your titles as brief yet as informative as possible. If the title is brief and informative, then it becomes very easy for the reader to understand what it is that the visual aid is about. Titles typically include both a number and a description. Visual aids are numbered consecutively, either in one long sequence through the entire communication or with a new sequence in each chapter. So you will decide whether you want to use one long sequence through the entire communication, where even though the visual aids are in different chapters, you just continue the numbering, or whether you will start from the number 1 in every chapter. According to custom, the numbers assigned to figures are usually Arabic, while numbers assigned to tables are either Arabic or Roman. Conventions about where to place the titles also varies. In typewritten communications, titles are almost always placed above the table and below figures. So if it's a table, then the title is above that, and if it's a figure, then the title is below that when your communication is typewritten. Generally also, the titles are centered between the margins, so they will be in the center of the margins of your visual aid. Within a single typeset communication, all tables share a consistent placement of titles and even also figures share a consistent placement of titles. This basically means that however, whether you're placing your titles above the table or below the table, or above the figure or below the table, you will continue to do the same for all the tables and all the figures in your communication. तो अगर आपने tables के ऊपर title लिख रहे हैं, तो फिर आप उस communication में जितने tables हैं उन सब के ऊपर title लिखेंगे. अगर आप नीचे लिख रहे हैं तो सब में ही नीचे लिखेंगे. जो जिस तरह भी आप choose करें, एक consistency होनी चाहिए आपके format में. Long reports, proposals and instruction manuals sometimes have special tables of content that list the number, title and location of each individual visual aid. क्योंकि अगर ज़्यादा visual aids इस्तेमाल किए गए हों, बहुत लंबी communication हो, तो फिर उनकी भी एक list होती है, contents page होता है, जो list of tables of figures जिसमें बताए जाते हैं. You should note that sometimes you don't need to provide a title for a visual aid. This happens, for instance, when you are including a very short table in your text in a way that makes perfectly clear what the table contains. अगर आपका एक छोटा सा टेक्स्ट है, एक छोटा सा टेबल है उस टेक्स्ट के अंदर, और आपने टेक्स्ट में ही क्लियरली बता दिया है कि उस टेबल के अंदर क्या चीज़ है, तो फिर आपको उसके लिए अलग से टाइटल देने की ज़रूरत नहीं है. Similarly, the visual aids in brochures are often untitled, though in reports and proposals you usually have titles. One important guideline is that you should resist the temptation to let your decisions about visual aids be determined by what you have handy or what you have done in some previous situation. ये ख्याल रखें आप कि ये ना हो कि आप अपना काम बचाने के लिए या सुस्ती में जो आपके पास पहले से कोई विजुअल एड्स आपने बनाए हुए हैं किसी और सिचुएशन में, आप उनको इस्तेमाल कर लें, या आप अपनी जो कम्युनिकेशन है उसको चेंज करें कोई पुराने विजुअल एड्स को फिट इन करने के लिए, या कोई ऐसे विजुअल एड्स को फिट इन करने के लिए जो आपके पास ज़्यादा आसानी से हैं, जबकि दूसरे विजुअल एड्स आपको मेहनत करके बनाने पड़ेंगे। अगर आप ये करेंगे तो फिर आपकी जो अप्रोच है वो राइटर सेंटर्ड हो जाएगी, फिर आप अपनी कन्वीनियंस देख रहे हैं और इसलिए आप अपनी इस हिसाब से अपनी कम्युनिकेशन को लिख रहे हैं, ना कि रीडर की अंडरस्टैंडिंग और रीडर की कन्वीनियंस आप देख रहे हों। And therefore you should avoid taking a writer-centered approach to visual aids, but try to take a reader-centered approach. Take an approach that is most likely to be useful or persuasive to your readers. Don't rely on material that is handy just because it's more convenient. You also need to fully integrate your visual aids with your prose. जो भी आप visual aids इस्तेमाल कर रहे हैं उनको अपने जो आपने प्रोज है, जो टेक्स्ट इस्तेमाल किया है, लिखा है, उसके साथ अच्छी तरह इंटीग्रेट करें। आपके विजुअल एड का कोई ना कोई रेफरेंस आपके टेक्स्ट में होना चाहिए। ये नहीं कि टेक्स्ट में कुछ लिखा है, विजुअल एड कुछ और है और उनका आपस में कोई कनेक्शन नहीं बन रहा। You should integrate your text with your visual aid so that they work together harmoniously to create a single unified message. आपस में जो भी आपका टेक्स्ट और विजुअल एड मैसेज दे रहे हैं वो उनमें यूनिटी होनी चाहिए। There are 3 different ways in which you can do this. You can introduce your visual aid in your prose. जो आपने अपना प्रोज लिखा है, जो टेक्स्ट लिखा है, उसमें आप पहले अपने विजुअल एड का इंट्रोडक्शन दें। Or you can state the conclusions that you want your readers to know. आप अपने टेक्स्ट में ये कहें, बताएं कि आप इस टेबल की या इस डायग्राम से कंक्लूजन्स क्या ड्रॉ होती हैं। एंड ऑल्सो you try to make your visual aids easy to find. अपने रीडर्स को बताएं कि विजुअल एड कहाँ आपने इस्तेमाल किया है ताकि वो आराम से उसको ढूंढ सकें। Now introducing your visual aid in your prose. Let's talk briefly about this aspect. When people read sequentially, एक चीज़ के बाद दूसरी चीज़, when they read sequentially through a written communication, they read one sentence, then the next, then the next, or they read one paragraph, then the next, and so on. When you want the next element that they read to be a visual aid, then rather than it being a sentence or a paragraph, then you will carefully direct the reader's attention to that visual aid. अपने prose में आप उस visual aid का फिर हवाला देंगे. So you will steer your readers from your prose to the visual aid to indicate that this is now what they will be seeing next. Sometimes your introduction to a visual aid will have to include information that your readers or listeners need in order to understand or use the visual aid. Whatever kind of introduction you make to a visual aid, place it at the exact point where you would like your readers to focus their attention to it. जब आप अपने visual aid का हवाला देंगे अपने टेक्स्ट में, तो ये ख्याल रहे कि उसी मौके पे आपके रीडर्स आपके विजुअल एड को ढूंढना शुरू कर देंगे या देखना चाहेंगे। तो जहां आप चाहते हैं कि आपके रीडर्स की अटेंशन आपके टेक्स्ट पे से हट के विजुअल एड पे जाए, आप वहीं अपने विजुअल एड का हवाला दें। यू कैन ऑल्सो स्टेट द कंक्लूजन्स you want your readers to draw from the visual aid. Remember that a visual aid presents your readers with a set of facts, and unless you tell the readers what conclusions you are making or what conclusions you want them to draw from the facts, they may draw a different one than the one that you want them to draw. So you need to point out the conclusion to them so that your conclusion and their conclusion can be the same. अगर आप जो conclusion आपने draw किया, अगर आप उसको नहीं clearly बताएंगे, तो वो उस diagram को या उस table को देख के शायद कोई और conclusion draw कर लें. Consider, for example, the way a writer discussed a graph that showed how many orders he thought his company would receive for its rubber houses over the next 6 months. The graph that he used showed that there would be a sharp decline in orders from automobile plants, and the writer feared that his readers might focus on that fact. So he wrote the following section to steer them to his point. ग्राफ में कुछ और चीज़ भी दिखाई गई थी और कोई ऐसी चीज़ भी थी जो राइटर दिखाना चाह रहे थे, तो उनने देखते हैं कि उनने अपने पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू के ऊपर एम्फोसाइज करने के लिए किस तरह रीडर्स की अटेंशन stair की. As figure 7 indicates, our outlook for the next 6 months is very good. Although we predict fewer orders from automobile plants, we expect the slack to be taken up by increased demand among auto part outlets. So here, although the decrease in orders from automobile plants is obvious in the graph, the writer skillfully used that but shown that that is not the main concern, that he's acknowledged that decrease, but he wants to highlight something else. He wants to highlight the increase amongst the auto part outlets. So he's talked about that. You might find it helpful to think of the sentences in which you explain a visual aid's significance as a special kind of a topic sentence. हमने पहले lectures में topic sentences की बात की है कि एक paragraph का topic sentence जो होता है वो उस paragraph का सारा gist बताता है. इसी तरह आपका जो sentence है जो आपकी visual aid की conclusion दे रहा है उसको भी आप एक topic sentence ही समझें, क्योंकि वो आपकी पूरे visual aid का gist जो है वो reader को बता रहा है. You need to remember that the sentences in which you explain the visual aid significance are just like the topic sentence at the head of a paragraph. Like the sentence where you can tell what will follow, similarly you will use a sentence that will tell what conclusions you have made. Now, a third thing that we talked about was making your visual aids easy to find. What happens when your readers come to a statement in which you ask them to look for a certain visual aid? Instead of going on to read the text, they start looking for the visual aid. They stop reading, their mind stops concentrating on the prose, and their mind starts concentrating on where the visual aid is. You would want them to, you would want that search for the visual aid to be as short and as simple as possible, so that they can concentrate on the content of your visual aid and the content of your text, rather than wasting their time and energy looking for the visual aid. So therefore, you should put your visual aid where your readers can locate it quickly. The ideal location for a visual aid is on the same page as the prose that accompanies the visual aid. Ideally, बेहतरीन location एक visual aid की वो है जहाँ आपने जो प्रोज है वो इस्तेमाल किया है, जिसमें आप विजुअल एड का रेफरेंस दे रहे हैं, उसी पेज पे आप विजुअल एड को भी रखें, ताकि जब रीडर्स पढ़ें कि अब इस टेबल में आप ये देख रहे हैं तो सामने ही उनके टेबल आ जाए. Not only will this make the visual aid easy to find, but your readers will be able to look back and forth between the prose and the visual aid if necessary. अगर उनको ज़रूरत पड़ेगी रीडर्स को तो वो फिर आराम से प्रोज भी पढ़ सकते हैं, टेबल भी देख सकते हैं और बार बार दोनों को देख सकते हैं, कंपेयर कर सकते हैं कि क्या कहा गया, और जो भी हवाले हैं वो देख सकते हैं अगर उनको ज़रूरत है उसको बार बार देखने की तब. लेकिन अगर आपका प्रोज कहीं और है, विजुअल एड ढूंढने के लिए उनको 2 सफ़े आगे जाना पड़ता है, तो फिर उनको दुश्वारी होगी समझने में कि आप और कनेक्शंस बनाने में आपके विजुअल एड और प्रोज के दरमियान. However, you may not always have room for the visual aid on the same page as the prose that is accompanying it. If your communication has text on facing pages, 2 सफ़े हैं जिन दोनों के ऊपर टेक्स्ट है, तो फिर आप ये कोशिश कीजिए कि एक के ऊपर आपका टेक्स्ट हो और दूसरे के ऊपर आपका विजुअल एड हो, ताकि वो आमने सामने आ जाएं. So try to, then you can do that if there's not space on the same page. If your communication does not have facing pages, try to put the visual aid on the next page following the introduction. जाहिर है अगर मजबूरी है, आपके उस पेज के ऊपर भी जगह नहीं है, सामने वाले पेज के ऊपर भी जगह नहीं है, तो फिर आप अगले पेज के ऊपर उस विजुअल एड को इंक्लूड करेंगे. If you place your visual aid further away than that, अगर अगले सफ़े पे भी नहीं है और दूर है, for example एक appendix में है, then you can help your readers by providing the number of the page on which the aid is to be found. For example, you can say a detailed sketch of this region of the new building's floor plan is shown in figure 17 in appendix C, page 53. ये पेज नंबर आप ब्रैकेट्स में लिख सकते हैं. So in conclusion, visual aids can greatly increase the clarity and impact of your written communication. To use visual aids well, you need to follow the same reader-centered approach as you would when writing your prose. जिस तरह के आप एक प्रोज लिखते हुए अपने रीडर्स को मद्देनजर रखते हैं, इसी तरह आप विजुअल एड्स इस्तेमाल करते हुए भी अपने पढ़ने वालों को मद्देनजर रखेंगे. Because this will enable you to decide where to use your visual aids, how to make them effectively, and integrate them successfully in your prose. In this lecture today, we learned to look for places where visual aids will help you achieve your communication objectives. We learned to choose visual aids that are appropriate to our objectives. We also learned the importance of using visual aids which are easy to understand and use, and how to do that. And finally, we talked about integrating your visual aids with your prose. कि आपने अपने visual aids को अपने prose के साथ किस तरह connect करना है, किस तरह उनकी relationships दिखानी है, और क्या मकसद है आपके connections का. With this, we come to the end of today's lecture on the use of visual aids in all types of business and written communications. If you have any queries, please feel free to contact us. Until next time, Allah Hafiz.